Hi, everyone. So this is the mini lecture for police psychology. It's also going to be one of the shorter mini lectures, just content-wise. There's a lot more of kind of self-exploration with this one, so you'll see more things posted in the modules. All right. So when we look at police psychology, it kind of goes into two different realms. One is the selection of police officers, and then the other one would be the retention. How do we keep police officers on staff? Um, and so when we look at police officers as a whole, I think it's important to note that while we typically will hear stories of the officers that do not deserve to have that position, that there's many more officers out there that we will never hear any negative things about. Um, and so what we call this in social psychology is the availability heuristic, that you're much more likely to hear of a police officer doing something negative than positive if you're reading news articles or watching the news or anything like that. And I'm not saying that we should bury negative things officers are doing. Like, absolutely, we need to get that out, and we need to promote it, and we need to make sure that people are aware that officers are doing wrong when they actually are doing wrong. But again, the public perception then becomes, well, officers are corrupt or racist or whatever else might be going on. And again, certainly there are going to be some officers that fit that mold, but when we look at the overall statistics, the majority are not. So part of this has to do with the selection process, and it has gone through different changes over time. Um, there was a pretty big debate about, do we do a screen out or a screen in process? Um, Screen in is where you pretty much look for certain characteristics, and if they have that characteristic, you bring them in. This would be kind of the old school way of doing it, because it used to be the idea of like, well, it's a police officer. That means that it's going to be a male who ultimately has a decent build, fairly athletic, um, and that was kind of it, having those physical characteristics. And if you had them, then yeah, come on in, apply for the job. Now we're seeing more of a screen out process, that we're kind of saying anybody can be an officer if it's something that you want to do, but we're going to put you through different tasks. So there's a physical fitness task. There's, as we'll get into, personality, cognitive tests, background checks. And, if you pass all that stuff, then yeah, we will ultimately consider you for a position. If you fail at any one of those, you will be screened out of the process. So in 1917, one of the selection criteria was an intelligence test. The Stanford Binet intelligence test, one of the earliest forms. And that intelligence test was the precursor to what we currently see. Um, it had things like the children's Binet test, which obviously they're not giving the children's test to police officers, but it would ask you about like physical attractiveness between these two faces, which one is more attractive. Just weird things like that. And so the adult one, obviously designed for adults, but still would not be what we would think of as a intelligence test today. But 1917 was when that was introduced, and it ran for a good 20-ish years before people started to think like, all right, just because you scored decent on this intelligence test, does that mean that you are capable of doing the things that police officers are being asked to do? So 1940s and 50s come along, and ultimately there's kind of this shift into more personality and psychological tests. Um, this would still be a lot of the projection test things, so like the Rorschach test, which is the ink blot. You look at an ink blot, tell me what you see, and based upon what your answer is, it tells the evaluator something about your personality. There's another projection test known as the um, house tree person, where you have to draw a house, a tree, and a person. and that tells us something about your personality. These are heavily criticized in modern psychology. Not saying they're not used, but to say we know somebody's personality because of the way they drew a house is just not correct anymore. It's more so viewed as it's a tool belt for therapists to have, and depending on the population, it may yield better findings than others. Psychological tests, these are going to be looking at things like antisocial personality disorder. Obviously, if somebody is considered a sociopath, maybe not the best job as a police officer. Maybe we can find something else for them to do, but those type of things. And then today we have background checks, medical exams, so you will have a physical. You'll also go through different physical tasks. So, you have to run a mile, and so quickly you have to do so many push-ups and sit-ups in a certain amount of time. And it's not like it's hidden away, the fitness test. It's widely publicized, so you know exactly what the criteria is and what the threshold you have to be at. And then cognitive and personality tests, sometimes a polygraph as well. Talked about polygraphs already. And again, just because they're not admissible in court does not mean that they cannot be used for hiring. If you're working with really any federal government position, odds are you will be given a polygraph, and you can protest all that you want about how we know the accuracy rate is 82 to 87%. They don't care. It's not about trying to find out anything deep or secret about you. It's, are you going to lie? And that's really a lot of the cognitive personality tests as well. Is, are you trying to deceive your future employer? And if you are, you're probably not going to get that job. Tim Harris ultimately will use the phrase, if you lie, you die, in the job search. And absolutely. And there's a lot of kind of checkpoints to see, is somebody actually lying? One of the big personality tests is the MMPI, which stands for the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And that is a massive test. It's like 500 or 600 items. There is a bunch of things happening behind the scenes in that test, that I've been on different police officer forums where people are, in the cadet program, or they're at the academy and they're about to go do their testing, and they are asking people about the answer key, and there isn't one. Like, the test is designed to kind of look at mental illness. So like, it wasn't designed for police officers, but it's used because there's a bunch of questions that are phrased slightly different, but getting at the same thing to see, like, are you lying about this? And then there's just some weird ones as well. One in the first iteration, which I'll post some questions on Canvas, um, just so you can see them. But it's like, I've been possessed by a demon. Well, obviously you should answer that a particular way. But other ones, I think the first question is, I like mechanics magazines. Who cares? Regardless of what your answer is on that, it's not going to prevent you from getting a job. It's not going to help you from getting a job. It's just a question that's asked. There's a bunch of filler questions in there as well. And so again, it's used, but it's not used to see like how stable you are. Now it can get parceled out, but it's used much more to figure out, are you trying to deceive or lie about any of these things? So when we look at police selection, we have two stages of kind of evaluation. First one, with the job analysis, is KSAs, known as knowledge, skills, and abilities. These are going to vary across different positions in police forces. So obviously, the knowledge, skills, and abilities is somebody who is, um, you know, uh, working a beat, so kind of entry level, versus a detective. We would want those to be a little bit different. Same thing with like somebody that specializes in canine versus SWAT. They're going to have different knowledge, skills, and abilities, and recognizing that not all police officers need to have the same ones. Some are going to be more tailored to different types of roles than others. So these are just some examples that probably we would like to see across the board. And then again, as you get into the different positions, you can become more focused on what would be necessary. But honesty, obviously, that is going to be a big thing. It helps establish trust, reliability, sensitivity. Sensitivity here not meaning that you are overly sensitive. It means that you recognize what you're dealing with. And again, from my area, I've seen it both ways, to where I've seen an officer who actually exhibits sensitivity with a victim of sexual assault and actually comforts, the victim. And again, it's not like cuddly comforting. They're still doing their job, but it's giving them time, letting them actually think through what happened, letting them share their story, even if some of it's not really that relevant, but just letting them talk. And I've also seen the flip side of that, to where it is an officer who, just wants to leave, pretty much just wants to get out of the situation. And so, yep, tell me what you need. All right, it looks like you're kind of struggling right now. Here's my card. Let me know if anything comes up. And they're gone in, you know, 5 6 minutes. And it's like, okay, this person was just victimized. That's the type of sensitivity. So again, it's not that you need to, cry with victims or anything else. You just need to show them that you actually do care about them, not just about the crime that happened to them. Communication skills. This one is major, and there's verbal communication skills, which are important, but also written communication skills as well. So being able to do both. Motivation, um, motivation to continue to do the best job that you can. Motivation to move up as well is always promising. Not saying that everybody needs to be looking to become, a police chief or anything like that, but it does help that it shows you're thinking long term. Officers historically, I think the average is 5 to 7 years, and then there's burnout that happens. So getting motivated to kind of move up or specialize in different things does help. Problem solving skills. You're dealing with humans, and from the psychology side of things, we recognize like that means you are dealing with unknowns constantly. Um, so sometimes you need to be creative on how do you actually solve what is going on here. I'm going to show, or I'll have linked in a bunch of different videos on Canvas, and one is dealing with a domestic disturbance call where both of them are saying that they have a right to be where they're at and they want the officers to arrest the other person. And it's not as if the officers go in knowing, all right, well, we have the lease that they signed and we can see who actually belongs here. Like typically they're just going in to hear the problem and then try to figure it out. So yeah, I mean, we certainly have guidebooks on how to handle different things, but it's not going to be able to cover every single situation. And then being a good teammate. Most of the time, you will be working with others, and having a reputation as somebody who's easy to work with and who is willing to um, share the load is important. All right, second one, construction and validation. So for forensic psychologists, it's our job, if you're going into more the police psychology realm, to develop instruments that measure KSAs. We call this the construction, and then to ultimately validate those as well. So you develop them to measure, and then you also develop instruments that relate to KSAs. And so it's, without going into too much of the psychometrics, this is kind of the very nerdy process that we do see forensic psychologists go into. If you do not enjoy stats or math, this is probably not the area. You would probably want to be more into like the actual testing instead of the development of them. But what what forensic psychologists do in this area is they try to do predictive validity on job performance. So what are the variables that we can look at that if we know, we can pretty much predict how well they're going to do on a police force. And so these things, just again, some examples: punctuality. If you have somebody who's constantly showing up late to work, that's a red flag. And again, it's not saying that if you showed up late once, it's saying that there's a repeated pattern that goes on, and especially how they handle it. If they have a legitimate reason for not being punctual, that needs to be taken into account. But if they're constantly making excuses, well, there was road construction and I didn't know, and then I hit every single red light and then my alarm didn't go off, right? Like, okay, these are patterns that should be telling you you need to start your day earlier. Um, Different complaints brought against them. So absolutely, police officers, they're in a service position, which means that the public can file complaints against officers. This ultimately goes into internal investigations, and they then evaluate, is this a valid complaint or is it not? And if they're getting an officer who constantly is getting complaints against them, obviously it's a pretty big red flag. Now, again, each complaint needs to be investigated. So it's not just they have one person who constantly calls anonymously and gives random complaints about an officer that they met once, and none of them are valid. So it's not just looking at the number, it's looking at the credibility of the complaints. And then acclamations. So have they been honored with anything? Did they receive any type of award from the community or anything along those lines? We also have assessment centers. So police applicant behavior is observed by multiple people in these. Normally put in some kind of situational test, simulating real world tasks. So we actually will do this at CBC, typically in the summer, that I'll receive emails saying that um, the CCTE building is closed off this next week because police are running simulations in there. And so sometimes you might have a dedicated building known as an assessment center. Other times they're makeshift. They're what you have available to you. Tri-Cities is kind of a medium-sized area, so no assessment center is actually widely available. So instead, they'll use different buildings that are not really heavily occupied. And at like CDC, it works great if you're going to be doing training on school shootings or medical emergencies as well, because it's not a quick, easy in and out, right? You have to go through all the different parking lots. You have to go through potentially different buildings and all that type of stuff to figure out if somebody just says, hey, we have a medical emergency at the Pasco CBC campus. Great. It's a general location, but it's not specific. So how do you narrow that down? There's also different simulators that will showcase, bank robberies or hostage scenarios that, again, I'll have a video from Conan O'Brien. So it is comedy, but you'll get to see the simulator and what it looks like and what you're asked to do, which it's very artificial because you will be told like, well, you need to speak to the actor on the screen and tell them and give them commands. And again, it's all practice for when the time actually comes. Obviously, the person on the screen is probably not fully responding to your commands, but there is a lot of control that those running the scenario do have, that they can show up different cuts of different videos to show different scenarios based upon potentially what the police officer is saying. So again, the whole idea of this is to simulate real world tasks. And there's obviously to get experience, But on some positions, it's also to see, are you cut out to do it? I had a hostage negotiator in one of my classes when I was teaching in Minnesota, and he just needed to go for continuing education credits, and so he ended up taking my class. And him and I were talking about, you know, what it was like, and he's now a trainer, and he's like, absolutely, we give, our trainees about 5 to 10 seconds, and if they don't say anything in that time at any given point, we thank them for their time and we remove them from the program. Because if they're freezing up in a training simulation, they're likely to freeze up in a real world scenario as well, and we can't take that risk. And so again, just different assessment centers will measure different things. So police discretion, need for officers to distinguish between situations where adherence to the law is required versus flexible. Absolutely. The reality, and I always tell students this, is that if you leave your house, and even if you don't, you have the possibility of doing it, but if you leave your house, odds are you're breaking the law at some level, whether that is you ran a stop sign, you rolled through a stop sign, whether that's you're going over the speed limit, whether that's you jaywalked, whether that's you didn't follow a certain protocol. All these different things we do have laws against, and there's some laws that are on the books from way back that there was probably some reason for it. I know in Minnesota we had the law that you can't chase a grease pig. Don't know why, don't know what happened that made that a law, but it's there now. And so for anybody that's like, oh, let's go have some fun on the farm, they would be breaking the law. I think in Oregon, you are not allowed to um, leave a bottle of urine on the side of the road. And so again, why, I can't tell you, but obviously it was considered a big enough problem that they wanted to stop that. And so if you've ever been on a road trip and driver doesn't pull over and you urinate in the bottle, you need to hold on to it until you can throw it away. Apparently, so absolutely, there's things that we as civilians want some degree of flexibility on. Right, speeding is probably the biggest one that we want officers to understand that just because it's posted at 35, if I'm going 40, I'm not a danger to others. But yet, if somebody is going 60 in a 35, we want the police to stop them, right? So we call that police discretion, and we have reasons for giving police officers discretion. Um, Criminal justice system would become overwhelmed instantly if police were actually apprehending every single lawbreaker that they see. It can't hold up to that degree of stress. And so that's why typically there's kind of unwritten rules about what officers will actually look for. And, I've heard from different people, and so I'm not saying that this is the absolute truth, but, in Washington, at least in the Tri-Cities area, if you're on the highway and you're going, you know, 9 or under over the speed limit, so the speed limit's 60 and you're going 69 or less, you're probably not going to get pulled over because it isn't worth, the headaches and aggravation. If you're going 10 or more over, then yeah, you're likely to get pulled over. Now again, they can pull you over for going 61. It's not likely to happen, but absolutely it could. In Minnesota, I was always told it was about 6 over. And so again, different states, different trainings, different locations will have different standards. We also want to recognize suspects, right? That if you're dealing with a younger juvenile defendant, hopefully you're not being on as hard on them with like a vandal if they were to vandalize something as you are an adult, right? And recognizing that. Now obviously there's some crimes that doesn't really matter, like murder or rape or something like that, that we're saying, yeah, I don't really care how old they are. If they do that, we want them to be pursued. But your more minor charges, yeah, we don't want them to kind of take in all the juveniles that are doing these minor offenses. Same thing with recognizing mental disorders, which is becoming a bigger and bigger thing. Um, and again, one of the things that I will always promote to students, especially if you're looking at becoming a police officer, is you are asked to juggle a lot of balls, because you need to know all the different laws for your state, um, and then also any of the ordinances that your city has put in. You then are going to be asked to kind of do a little mental health counseling to figure out, is this person mentally ill? Are they drunk? Are they on something? Before you do whatever action you're going to take. You're also asked to kind of be a pseudo therapist to individuals and listen to their problems and try to figure out how can you best help them. I mean, it's a lot of things to go on top of having, not necessarily a medical background, but certainly like CPR training, things like that, because you will go to those calls as well if there's, injuries, things like that, and you're the closest person. I had an officer come and talk with my students, and I was like, could you just tell them about, an average day that you had? And he's like, this probably a little bit more severe than average, but it just recently happened. And he's like, I got a call to go take care of a dog that was barking, and the neighbor was upset. And as I'm trying to sort that out, I get an emergency call that there is I think a 3 or 4 month old baby that stopped breathing near where he was. So he left the neighbor dispute to go there, did CPR, and then the ambulance showed up, took the toddler. Then he got called to a traffic accident, and while he was finishing that up, he hears on the radio that the toddler didn't make it, and so that now weighs on him while he's trying to do this traffic accident thing, and then he gets another disturbing the peace call, and having to balance all that stuff out is it's very weighty on your mental health, your mental stability. And again, we're asking officers to kind of do more, as well as we're getting more and more research out there about, you know, what everything actually is when we look at those that break laws. And it's very easy to overwhelm the officer, which brings us then to police stress. So it is a high stress job, absolutely. And for anybody that has a police officer in in their life, you've probably seen this. And there is not a ton of great outlets for the officers. They're getting better, but we're still a little bit behind on that. Most of the time, officers are not allowed to talk with their family about ongoing cases or investigations. So while the person might want to know, your spouse, so, rough day today, yep, anything you want to talk about? Nope, because they can't. Not saying that they would otherwise, but ultimately, yeah, they cannot speak on ongoing stuff. So when we look at the types of stressors, occupational, so this is just being a police officer. This is going to be the stress of knowing that even very basic, simple things could result in, you know, injury or death. Right? That pulling somebody over for speeding might ultimately result in them, pulling a gun on you. And so that type of stressor is there. It is part of the job. It's one of the things that most officers say, I can deal with that because I signed up for it. Now again, some can't, and those officers typically just don't have long careers if they're not handling the occupational stress well. But if you're going to be an officer, it's one of the ones that you're very much aware of. The organizational stress, this is where people are kind of overwhelmed because this was not what they signed up for. So balancing budgets, trying to figure out, how do we get more money for the police department? How do we get better equipment, better training? How do we get officers the appropriate things that they need? On top of that, you might also have some type of internal investigation going on that's very publicized. Something of like Pasco back in, Jesus, shortly after I moved here, 2015 maybe, where they shot the individual who um, apparently was throwing rocks at vehicles, and that made national news. My mom actually called me up from Minnesota. Hey, I heard about this. You know, that ultimately is going to hinder that organization, knowing that, all right, this is going to be viewed repeatedly and it's going to be under investigation, and how do we get trust back, and things like that. Even if they felt that they were in the right, there's always going to be pushback from the public, which we'll get to. Criminal justice system, just in the whole, that now you get to see it closer, and it is one of the things that it's disheartening at times to see what is happening. Um, Again, in my area of sexual assault, I can't tell you how many judges or jury members that I've heard just say things. I'm like, really? This is where we're still at. Um, there was a case that happened locally not that long ago, where ultimately the person was convicted. The defendant was charged and convicted. I don't know the sentence length. I never followed up, but when the conviction happened, they interviewed the jury foreman and asked, "All right, so what happened? Why did you guys make the decision?" And they said the reason we made the decision was because the victim did not call the hospital right away, or the police, or anybody that we feel like they should have. They instead called their mom, and that ultimately tells us that they were very distraught at the time, and that's why we believe them. So no evidence told them, yes, this is likely to be sexual assault. It was because what the victim did after the event happened. And that's obviously not what we want the legal standard to be, is, well, we as a group think that this is why what somebody who was actually assaulted would do, when the research does not pan out at that at all. Victims typically do not behave in a uniformed way, especially immediately after. Um, so yeah, just troubling. And then I've also, heard judges make claims. There was a really famous one about women just need to keep their legs closed and they wouldn't be sexually assaulted. And this is coming from a judge. And again, it's cringeworthy, it's frustrating. It's like, you have the power of sentencing, right? The conviction will happen from a jury in the sexual assault cases, at least, but the sentence is the judge. So the judge that says that is likely to maybe do probation, likely to do, a very short sentence. And officers see this, right, all the time. They're typically called to testify, if they were the responding officer, and so they know what the outcomes are, and they ultimately see, people that they've arrested back on the street, and sometimes they're surprised, like, oh geez, I had you for assault and battery, and that was 6 months ago, and here you are, at the same store that I'm at, or whatever it happens to be. And then public, um, this one has certainly ramped up over the years, and just technology creates this opportunity. But yeah, the public is now always going to be watching you, and not that they weren't before, but they can now document it. And I'm not at all saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, right? Like, I recognize that police officers should be handling themselves in such a way that it should not matter if the public sees them. The public should be able to see an officer do his or her job and feel like, yeah, that's appropriate. Um, Now, the problem lies is that police officers are human. And I always use this example, where if you're a student and we were doing this face to face, I would have no problem with you recording my lectures on your phone, or camera, or whatever it happens to be. But if you were doing it right in front of me as I'm trying to lecture, or like 2 feet away from me, I'm probably gonna get a little bit more agitated, just because like you're invading my personal space while I'm trying to do my job. And my job is not extremely stressful, right? Like I talk about things that I find interesting and that I've spent a number of years studying. It's not trying to figure out who is actually in the wrong, or trying to figure out what evidence can I collect at this scene. And that's obviously very different. Right. And then last thing, exposure to stress results in physical, psychological, personal, and job related consequences. For example, higher risk to develop cardiovascular disease, so heart problems we see with police officers. I will say that is actually what killed my grandmother, who was a police officer for 31 years in Minneapolis. She had, I think, 3 different heart surgery procedures. And finally, it kind of took her. She also was going through Alzheimer's, but it was cardiovascular that ended up killing her. Higher risk for depression, anxiety, marital difficulties, and suicides. Yep. I mean, I think all those are fairly obvious, that when you look at what a police officer is doing day in and day out, it's likely to see all these things happen. And then job related consequences, poor morale. So just thinking that everybody is terrible people, thinking that what you're doing is not that valuable or important. That's poor morale. Absenteeism, you're not actually showing up for kind of the extra stuff. So not saying that police officers need to be at every single function that's going on, but having some appearances is valuable for both yourself and the community. um, and then early retirement, which big scheme, probably not the worst thing, but certainly when we're looking at trying to keep some standards, having people there for longer is important. That having the old guard train the new recruits is valuable, because you get to instill kind of what the culture of the department is. So, yeah, with that, that's it for the police psychology lecture. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate asking me.